Cast out by her cruel rancher father for being too fat to marry, Livia is given to a Bigfoot hunter as punishment. But what was meant to shame her becomes the first time she's truly loved. Livia hit the dusty ground hard, her elbows scraped raw, her knees jarred against the packed earth of the ranch yard. The heavy wooden doors of the ranch house slammed behind her with a finality that sounded like thunder in her chest. She scrambled to sit upright, her long dress wrinkled and dusty, her curls trembling where they clung to her damp cheeks. The ranch hands outside didn't spare her a second glance. They'd seen this scene before with other disappointments from the big house. The punishment had been delivered. Their part was over. Inside the house, her father's voice still echoed in her skull like the crack of a bullwhip. You shame this family with your gluttony and your defiance. You refuse every decent man who calls. You embarrass me in front of my business partners with your size. Let him have you. Perhaps a few weeks with that wild beast hunter will teach you to eat like a lady and behave like one. Maybe when you're done playing house with a savage who chases shadows in the mountains, you'll appreciate what civilization has to offer. And that was it. No more arguing. No tears could soften his heart. No pleading would change his mind. Livia was no longer the rancher's daughter of Wyoming's most powerful cattle baron. She was now property, given away like a broken tool, something useless that might find purpose in rougher hands. Her vision stung as she looked up at the man standing across from her in the dusty yard, backlit by the setting sun. He was a Bigfoot hunter. She could tell from the massive rifle slung across his broad shoulders, its barrel longer and thicker than any weapon she'd ever seen, designed for prey much larger than deer or elk. A collection of strange pelts hung from his leather belt and across his horse's saddle, furs with textures and colors that didn't match anything in her father's natural history books. His boots were worn from countless miles through untamed wilderness, the leather cracked and stained with substances she couldn't identify. Long scars crisscrossed his dark forearms, visible even in the dim light, marks from creatures most folks didn't believe existed, wounds that spoke of battles fought in places where civilized men feared to tread. But his eyes, they weren't cruel like the men who'd thrown her out. They weren't mocking like the suitors who'd called her pleasantly plump while calculating her father's wealth. They weren't even predatory like the ranch hands who whispered crude suggestions when they thought she couldn't hear. His eyes were stunned, uncertain, and perhaps the slightest bit gentle. He stared at her like he didn't know whether to help her up or retreat into the forest where such complications didn't exist. His name, she remembered faintly, was Marcus Washington, a tracker and hunter who came down from the high mountain country only when supplies ran desperately low or when desperate ranchers paid him extraordinary sums to clear their land of unnatural beasts. She'd seen him only twice before in her 22 years, once when she was a child of perhaps 7, peering from beneath a wagon tarp as he dragged something massive and fur-covered behind his horse, something that looked almost human but wasn't quite, and another time just last week when her father had hired him to investigate the strange disappearances of prize cattle from their northern pastures. The man had spoken maybe a dozen words total during that meeting, but his presence had filled the entire study, wild, controlled, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with living outside the rules that governed ordinary men. Now, somehow, through her father's twisted sense of justice, he was supposed to be her keeper. "You don't have to run back to your mountains," she said, her voice shaking more than she liked. The words came out sharper than intended, a defensive reflex learned from years of protecting herself from disappointment. They made it sound like I'm yours now, like some kind of payment for services rendered. He blinked slowly, like her words took a moment to settle in his mind. She watched his jaw work silently, processing not just what she'd said but the bitterness behind it. Then, with a faint crease appearing between his dark brows, he stepped forward. Not close enough to frighten her, but near enough that she could smell the pine smoke embedded in his buckskin jacket and the wild mountain air that clung to his hair like perfume. "I don't want a gift," he said finally, his voice low and unsure, roughened by years of speaking more to wilderness than to people. "I didn't ask for this arrangement. Your father paid me to track something that's been killing his livestock. That's where my obligation ends." "Neither did I," she replied, then immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious. They stood in silence for a long moment, both watching the other as if expecting the ground to shift beneath them or some external force to provide guidance for a situation neither had anticipated. The ranch yard stretched around them, empty now except for a few chickens pecking at grain scattered near the barn. In the distance, cattle lowed softly as ranch hands drove them toward the evening pastures. The sun continued its descent toward the western mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that should have been beautiful but somehow felt ominous instead. Then Livia's stomach growled loudly, a rumble that seemed to echo off the barn walls. She pressed her hand to it, mortified by this betrayal of her body at the worst possible moment, but Marcus only glanced toward his pack horse tied near the hitching post. Without a word, he walked over and began rummaging through leather saddlebags that looked as weathered and travel-worn as their owner. "Trail food," he said simply, returning with strips of dried venison and a flask that smelled of mountain water when he uncorked it. "It'll fill you, though it's not fancy." She stared at him, confused by this simple kindness. In her experience, men didn't feed women without expecting something in return, without making their generosity into a debt to be repaid in ways that made her skin crawl. "You're not going to hurt me?" He paused in the act of handing her the meat, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, but a deep, quiet sadness that seemed to age him years in the space of a heartbeat. "Do you think I'm like the beasts I hunt?" he asked, and there was no challenge in the question, only a genuine curiosity tinged with pain. "Like the creatures that take what they want by force and leave destruction behind?" That silenced her completely. She lowered her gaze, suddenly ashamed of her assumption. No one had ever asked her what she thought about anything, not with such careful attention to her answer. Not with such respect for her opinion. But the quiet in Marcus's tone held no mockery, no impatience with her ignorance of his world. Instead, she heard something else. A man who'd spent so long alone in the wilderness that he'd forgotten how to be cruel to another human being, if he'd ever known how in the first place. The dried venison was tough and salty, nothing like the delicate meals served in the ranch house dining room, but it was the first food she'd eaten all day. Her father had forbidden the kitchen staff from feeding her, claiming she needed to learn the consequences of her choices before being handed over to the mountain man. The water from Marcus's flask was cold and clean, tasting faintly of snow and pine needles. When she finished eating, he handed her a rough wool blanket from his pack, and her hands shook as she wrapped it around her shoulders. The evening air was growing cold, and her thin dress, chosen more for propriety than warmth, offered little protection against the mountain chill that descended with the darkness. Livia didn't speak as she sat by the small campfire Marcus built near the barn. She wasn't sure she could manage words without crying, and she'd cried enough for one day. He didn't ask questions or demand explanations. He simply sat cross-legged on the opposite side of the fire, carefully cleaning his massive rifle by the flickering light. The weapon was unlike anything she'd ever seen, custom-made, she realized, with a barrel thick enough to accommodate bullets the size of her thumb and a stock carved with symbols that looked almost native but weren't quite like any tribal markings she'd encountered in books. As he worked, Marcus hummed quietly under his breath, not a tune she recognized, but something that sounded like wind moving through pine trees or water running over stones. It was oddly soothing, this wordless music from a man who seemed more comfortable with silence than conversation. That night he made her a bed of pine boughs near the fire, laying them thick enough to cushion her body from the hard ground and arranging them with a care that spoke of long experience sleeping rough. He laid his own bedroll on the opposite side of the fire, positioning himself between her and the vast darkness where unseen eyes might be watching. Before settling down to sleep, he checked his rifle one final time and placed his massive hunting knife within easy reach. "The fire will keep most things away," he said quietly, "but holler if you hear anything that doesn't sound right." It was the first kindness she'd known in months, this simple offer of protection from a man who owed her nothing and had every reason to abandon her to whatever fate her father had intended. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound from the darkness, every owl hoot, every rustle of brush, every distant howl, made her heart race. She wasn't used to sleeping outdoors, wasn't accustomed to the symphony of night sounds that surrounded them. In her soft bed in the ranch house, with thick walls and locked doors between her and the wilderness, she'd never realized how alive the darkness could be. Marcus seemed to sense her restlessness. "First time sleeping under the stars?" he asked softly. "Yes," she admitted. "This louder than I expected." She heard him chuckle, a low sound that somehow made the darkness less frightening. "That's just the mountain talking. You'll learn to understand what it's saying soon enough." "And what is it saying tonight?" He was quiet for so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. "Then, that you're safe. That nothing will harm you while I'm here." Something in his voice, absolute certainty mixed with gentle protectiveness, finally allowed her to relax. She closed her eyes and let the mountain's lullaby carry her towards sleep, trusting for the first time in years that someone would watch over her while she was vulnerable. The next morning, Livia awoke to birdsong and the distant howl of something that didn't sound quite like a wolf, longer, deeper, with an almost musical quality that raised goosebumps along her arms. She sat up too quickly and immediately regretted it as the world spun around her. Her back ached from the unfamiliar bed, her feet were swollen from yesterday's ordeal, and her dress still smelled faintly of tears and humiliation. Marcus wasn't by the cold ashes of their fire. Panic flared in her chest like a struck match. Had he left her? Had he decided during the night that she was more trouble than whatever her father had paid him? Had he simply walked into the forest and disappeared, leaving her stranded between a home that had cast her out and a wilderness that would kill her within days? But before the panic could fully take hold, the brush rustled and Marcus emerged from the treeline, arms full of firewood, his face streaked with morning sweat and something that might have been mud or blood. His rifle was slung across his back, and she noticed fresh scratches on his hands that hadn't been there the night before. "You're awake," he said simply, dropping the wood near the fire pit with practiced efficiency. She nodded, brushing tangled hair from her face and trying to restore some semblance of dignity to her appearance. "I didn't thank you for last night. For the food, the blanket, the safety. You don't have to thank me for doing what any decent person should do." Still, something in his voice, something quiet and almost lonely, as if kindness were a language he rarely had opportunity to speak, made her wish she could express her gratitude more adequately. He laid out hardtack and dried berries from his pack, along with coffee beans he ground between two stones. The makeshift breakfast was simple but filling, and she found herself unexpectedly hungry despite the uncertainty of her situation. Then, to her surprise, he sat across from her like an equal, not standing at a respectful distance or treating her like fragile porcelain that might shatter if handled roughly. Livia blinked in amazement. "You're not afraid I'll report you for sitting in my presence? For treating me like a person instead of a possession?" He gestured toward the vast wilderness that surrounded them, mountain peaks stretching to the horizon in every direction, forests so deep and ancient they seemed to hold secrets older than civilization itself. "We're 50 miles from your father's ranch and getting farther every day. Out here, his rules don't reach. Out here, the only law is what a person can enforce with their own hands and their own conscience." That should have frightened her, the idea of existing beyond the protection of civilization, of being dependent entirely on the good intentions of a man she barely knew. But instead, she felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time in her life, she existed in a space where her father's disapproval couldn't touch her, where his expectations and demands and threats were as powerless as whispers in a hurricane. After breakfast, she surprised herself by offering to help break camp. Marcus looked at her with unconcealed disbelief, as if she'd suggested flying to the moon. "You want to help pack gear?" "Yes, me," she replied, rolling up her sleeves with more determination than skill. "I have hands, don't I? And if I'm going to be traveling with you, I should learn how to be useful." She was clumsy, of course. She tripped over tent stakes, couldn't figure out how to properly roll a bedroll, and once tried to lift a pack that was easily twice her weight. But Marcus didn't laugh at her failures or grow impatient with her inexperience. Instead, he showed her the proper techniques with the same careful attention he'd given to cleaning his rifle, serious, methodical, treating her education as something important. When she finally managed to secure a pack properly to his horse's saddle, he nodded approvingly. "You're learning." "I have a good teacher," she said, then blushed at her own boldness. They rode deeper into the mountains that day, following trails so faint Livia couldn't distinguish them from random animal paths. Marcus led the way on his sturdy mountain horse, a tough-looking animal that seemed as wild and independent as its owner. She rode behind on a more docile mare he'd somehow acquired, when she had no idea, since she didn't remember seeing a second horse the night before. "Where did she come from?" she asked, patting the mare's neck. "Payment from your father," Marcus replied without looking back. "Along with supplies for 2 weeks and a promise that you'd be manageable." There was something in his tone that made her suspect he was omitting parts of that conversation, probably the more insulting parts. "What exactly did he tell you about me?" Marcus reined in his horse and half-turned in the saddle to look at her. His dark eyes were serious, almost angry, but she sensed the anger wasn't directed at her. "He told me you were willful, disobedient, and too fat to attract a decent husband. He said you needed to learn humility and that a few weeks of rough living might teach you to appreciate the comforts of civilization." The words hit her like physical blows, even though she'd heard variations of them countless times before. Coming from Marcus's mouth, repeated with clinical precision, they somehow hurt worse than when her father had screamed them at her directly. "And what do you think?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Marcus studied her for a long moment, taking in her disheveled hair, her wrinkled dress, her soft hands that had never known real work, her full figure that her father considered such a shameful burden. "I think," he said slowly, "that you're braver than most people I've known, and that anyone who can't see your worth doesn't deserve to have it offered to them." The simple declaration took her breath away. No one had ever called her brave before. No one had ever suggested she had worth beyond her potential value as a marriage prospect or her failure to meet her father's expectations. They rode on in comfortable silence for a while, climbing higher into country that grew wilder and more beautiful with each mile. The trees changed from familiar oaks and cottonwoods to towering pines and strange species she couldn't identify. The air grew thinner, cleaner, carrying scents of snow and stone and growing things she'd never encountered before. "This is incredible," she said during a rest stop, looking out over a valley that stretched endlessly toward distant peaks. "How do you know where we're going?" "Been hunting these mountains for 15 years, Marcus replied, checking his horse's hooves for stones. "Know every trail, every water source, every cave worth sheltering in. The land talks to you if you learn how to listen." "What does it say?" He glanced up at her, and she caught a glimpse of something playful in his expression. "Right now? It's saying there's weather coming from the west, probably rain by evening. It's saying the deer have been using that game trail heavily. See how the grass is worn down? And it's saying something big has been through here recently, something that doesn't belong to any species I know." A chill ran down her spine. "Something big?" Marcus stood, dusting off his hands, and pointed to marks in the soft earth near the stream where they'd stopped to water the horses. Tracks human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too big, too deep, wrong number of toes. Livia followed his gaze and saw what he was indicating. Impressions in the mud that did indeed look like footprints, but footprints that could have been made by a giant. They were easily twice the size of Marcus's boots, with strange elongated proportions that made her think of human feet stretched and enlarged beyond all reasonable dimensions. "What do you think made them?" "That's what I'm here to find out," Marcus said, shouldering his pack. "Your father's been losing cattle to something, and these tracks have been showing up all around his property. Whatever's making them has been getting bolder, coming closer to human settlements." "And you think it's?" "I try not to think too much about what it might be until I see it with my own eyes," Marcus replied. "But I've been tracking creatures like this for most of my adult life, and there are more things living in these mountains than most folks would believe." As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed through the valley, not quite a howl, not quite a roar, but something that combined elements of both and added harmonics that seemed designed to resonate in human bones. The horses shifted nervously, ears flattened against their heads. Marcus went very still, one hand moving instinctively to his rifle. "That's new," he said quietly. "New how?" "I've never heard that exact call before. It's similar to others, but—" He trailed off, listening intently as the sound came again, closer this time. "It's curious. Most of the big predators up here make noise to warn things away. This sounds more like..." "Like what?" Marcus looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Like it's trying to communicate. They made camp that evening in a small clearing Marcus had used before, sheltered on three sides by towering pine trees and open to the south where the last rays of sunlight could reach their fire. As promised, rain began falling just as they finished setting up Marcus's sturdy canvas tent, not the deluge she'd feared, but a steady mountain shower that drummed against the trees and filled the air with the scent of wet pine and clean stone. Livia sat just inside the tent opening, watching Marcus tend their fire in the rain. He'd rigged a simple shelter over it using his rain slicker and some rope, creating a dry space where coffee could boil and dinner could cook. His movements were economical, practiced, speaking of countless nights spent in similar conditions. "How long have you been living like this?" she asked. 15 years, give or take. Marcus poked at the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the rainy darkness. "Since just after the war ended." "Were you a soldier?" He nodded, not looking at her. 10th Cavalry. Buffalo soldiers, they called us. Spent 3 years fighting Indians and chasing outlaws across territory that made this look civilized. Livia absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the image of Marcus as a young cavalry trooper with the solitary mountain man sitting across from her. "What made you leave the army for? This?" Marcus was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the tent, and somewhere in the darkness beyond their fire, something large moved through the underbrush, deliberately, carefully, but definitely there. "Lost my whole patrol to something that wasn't supposed to exist," he said finally. Apache guides swore there were demons in those particular mountains, but the lieutenant didn't believe in demons. Ordered us to pursue a raiding party straight into territory the locals said was cursed. He stirred the coffee with a metal spoon, the sound unnaturally loud in the intimate space of the tent. "Found the raiders, all right. Found them torn apart by something that left tracks like these." He gestured toward where they'd seen the strange footprints, only bigger. "Found my men the same way. All except me." "What happened to you?" Marcus finally looked up, and in the firelight she saw something haunted in his eyes. "I saw it. Just for a moment, in the moonlight. 12 feet tall, covered in dark fur, eyes that looked almost human. It could have killed me easy as breathing, but it didn't. It just looked at me for the longest time, like it was trying to figure out what I was doing there. Then it disappeared into the rocks." He paused, sipping coffee from a battered tin cup. "Spent 2 days walking out of those mountains. When I finally reached the fort and told my story, they said I was suffering from shock and grief, that I'd imagined the whole thing. Said the Apache had probably circled back and finished off my patrol while I was unconscious from some kind of head injury. But you knew better." "I knew what I saw." Marcus's voice was firm, certain. "And I knew I had to understand what it was. So I left the army, came up here where the old hunters tell similar stories, and started tracking." "Have you found any others?" "Signs, mostly. Tracks, disturbed campsites, animals killed in ways that don't match any known predator. A few glimpses in the distance that might have been shadows, might have been bears, might have been something else entirely." He looked directly at her. "But nothing like what happened today." "What do you mean?" Marcus set down his coffee and moved closer to the tent opening, peering out into the rain-soaked darkness. "The sounds we heard this afternoon, they weren't random. They were too purposeful, too timed. And the tracks we found weren't old. Maybe a few hours at most." A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air ran down Livia's spine. "You think we're being followed?" "I think we've attracted attention." Marcus reached for his rifle, checking the massive cartridges in the breech. "Question is whether that's good or bad." As if in answer to his words, the sound came again, that same musical howl they'd heard in the valley, but much closer now. Close enough that Livia could hear the complex harmonies within it, the way it seemed designed to carry meaning rather than just emotional content. The horses nickered nervously where they were picketed under the trees. Marcus stood slowly, rifle in hand but not raised, listening with the focused attention of a man whose survival had depended on interpreting sounds in the darkness. "It's circling us," he said quietly, "staying just outside the firelight. But it's not trying to hide, If it wanted to, we'd never know it was there. What does that mean? I think, Marcus said slowly, it means it wants something. And I think that something might be you. Before Livia could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, a shadow moved at the edge of their camp, massive, upright, definitely not bear or elk or any other creature that belonged in these mountains. It paused just beyond the reach of their firelight, clearly visible but somehow respecting the boundary their fire created. Marcus made a decision that surprised her. Instead of raising his rifle, he reached into his pack and pulled out a large piece of the jerked venison they'd been eating. Moving slowly, deliberately, he walked to the edge of the light and placed the meat on a flat stone, then stepped back with his hands clearly visible and empty. "What are you doing?" Livia whispered. "Something I should have tried years ago," he replied, never taking his eyes off the shadow. "Instead of hunting, I'm trying to communicate." For long moments, nothing happened. The rain continued to fall. The fire crackled and popped. The shadow remained perfectly still, as if considering this unexpected offer. Then it moved forward into the light, and Livia's breath caught in her throat. The creature was enormous, easily 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur that gleamed wet in the firelight. Its proportions were human-like but stretched and enlarged, with arms that hung nearly to its knees and hands that could have crushed a man's skull without effort. But its face, while primitive and ape-like, held an unmistakable intelligence. Its eyes, deep-set beneath a heavy brow ridge, studied them with curiosity rather than aggression. It approached the offering cautiously, never taking its gaze off Marcus and Livia, then picked up the meat with surprising delicacy and examined it carefully before taking a bite. It chewed thoughtfully, as if evaluating not just the taste but the intent behind the gift. Then it did something that made Livia's heart skip. It nodded to Marcus, a clearly human gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps gratitude. The creature melted back into the darkness as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving no trace except the empty stone and the memory of intelligent eyes reflecting firelight. Marcus returned to the tent, his hands shaking slightly. "Did you see that?" Livia nodded, unable to speak. 15 years I've been hunting these creatures," Marcus whispered, "and I never once considered that they might be hunting me for the same reason, curiosity. The need to understand." "It seemed almost gentle," Livia managed to say. "It could have killed us both without breaking stride," Marcus agreed. "Could have torn through this camp like paper and been gone before we knew what happened. But instead it accepted a gift and showed gratitude." He looked at her with an expression of wonder mixed with something deeper. "Your father may have done us both a favor, throwing us together like this. I don't think I would have had the courage to try communication instead of confrontation if I'd been alone." "What do you mean?" Marcus settled beside her in the tent, closer than propriety would normally allow but somehow appropriate given what they'd just experienced. "You change the mathematics of survival. When it's just me, I can afford to take risks, to be aggressive, to shoot first and ask questions later. But with you here, I have to think differently. I have to consider what's worth protecting and what's worth understanding." The implications of his words settled over her like a warm blanket. For the first time in her life, her presence had made someone better rather than worse. Her very existence had inspired wisdom rather than frustration. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me as someone worth protecting. For making me feel like I might be valuable." Marcus turned to face her fully, and in the firelight she saw something in his expression that made her heart race. "Livia, you are valuable. Not because of what you might do for someone else, but because of who you are. Because you made me consider kindness instead of violence. Because you made me remember that understanding something is more important than conquering it." When he kissed her, soft, reverent, tentative, she tasted rain and coffee and something wild and clean that spoke of mountain air and vast open spaces. It was her first kiss, and it came not from duty or social expectation or her father's attempts to marry her off, but from genuine affection and respect and wonder. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Livia rested her forehead against his and whispered, "I think I'm falling in love with you." "I know I am," Marcus replied. Outside their tent, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, A creature that shouldn't exist stood guard over two humans, learning that love was the most natural thing in the world. The next morning brought clear skies and gifts. Livia woke to Marcus moving quietly around their camp, examining items that definitely hadn't been there the night before. He held up a bundle of plants she didn't recognize, roots and leaves arranged with obvious care and tied together with what looked like braided grass. "Medicine," he said when he saw her watching. "Some I know, some I don't, but all of them valuable. Mountain healers would pay good money for herbs like these." "It left them for us? That, or there's a very generous and knowledgeable hermit wandering around these mountains." Marcus's tone suggested he considered the creature explanation more likely. "There's more." He showed her a collection of stones arranged in a careful pattern near their fire pit. Not random rocks, but specimens that had clearly been selected for their color and shape. Some were deep blue-green like mountain lakes, others were shot through with veins of what might have been silver or quartz. "Pretty," Livia said, "but what do they mean?" "If I had to guess? They're markers. Directions." Marcus traced the pattern with his finger. "See how they point toward that gap in the ridgeline? I think we're being invited to follow a specific path. By a creature that could tear us apart if it wanted to. By a creature that brought us medicine and gifts instead," Marcus corrected. "I'm starting to think we've been looking at this all wrong. What if these beings aren't the monsters people claim they are? What if they're just different? Trying to coexist but forced to hide because humans shoot first and ask questions later?" The idea was revolutionary, almost heretical given everything Livia had been taught about the clear divisions between civilized and savage, human and beast. But after last night's encounter, after seeing intelligence and gentleness in those deep-set eyes, it made a kind of sense. They broke camp and followed the stone markers, climbing higher into country that grew steadily more spectacular and more remote. The trail, for it was clearly a trail, once Livia learned to recognize the subtle signs Marcus pointed out, led through forests of pine and aspen, across crystal-clear streams that ran cold even in midsummer, past meadows filled with wildflowers she'd never seen in her father's carefully maintained ranch gardens. "It's beautiful up here," she said during a rest stop. "Why don't more people come to places like this?" "Because it's dangerous if you don't know what you're doing," Marcus replied, refilling their water bottles from a spring that bubbled up from between granite boulders. "And because most people are afraid of what they might find in country this wild." "Are you afraid?" He considered the question seriously. "Used to be. Afraid of the unknown, afraid of things that didn't fit into the categories I understood. But fear makes you stupid, makes you reactive instead of thoughtful." He looked at her with that increasingly familiar expression of wonder. "You've helped me remember that curiosity is stronger than fear, if you let it be." They rode on through country that seemed untouched by human presence. No roads, no fences, no signs of logging or mining or any of the other ways civilization typically marked its territory. Just wilderness in all its raw, magnificent complexity. But Livia was beginning to understand that untouched didn't mean uninhabited. She saw signs now that Marcus pointed out. Trees with bark stripped away in patterns too regular to be natural, arrangements of stones that looked random until you realized they marked sources of water or safe passage through difficult terrain, clearings where the grass grew in suspicious circles that spoke of regular use by large creatures. "How many of them do you think there are?" she asked. "Up here? Hard to say. Enough to maintain a population, obviously, but not so many that they couldn't stay hidden." Marcus paused to examine what looked like a deliberately constructed windbreak made from fallen logs and carefully placed stones. "What's interesting is how organized this all seems. These aren't just random creatures living like animals. There's intelligence here, planning, maybe even culture." That afternoon, they found the cave. It wasn't marked on any map Marcus carried, wasn't visible from the trail until you knew exactly where to look. But the stone markers led directly to a narrow opening in the cliff face, partially concealed by hanging vegetation but clearly artificial in origin, or at least, artificially enlarged from a natural formation. "This is it," Marcus said, dismounting and approaching the entrance carefully. "This is what we were being led to." Livia followed, her heart hammering with a mixture of excitement and terror. The cave mouth was tall enough for Marcus to enter upright, wide enough for two people to walk side by side, but dark enough that its depths remained mysterious. Should we go in? Marcus lit a torch made from pitch-soaked wood and held it up, revealing a passage that curved away into darkness. The walls were smooth, worn by water or tools or both, and covered with markings that looked almost like writing, symbols and pictographs that seemed to tell stories she couldn't read. "Together," he said, extending his hand to her. "Whatever's in there, we face it together." The passage opened into a vast underground chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows above their torchlight. But what took Livia's breath away wasn't the impressive geology, it was the evidence of habitation. The cave had been furnished, arranged, made into something approaching a home. Sleeping areas marked by carefully arranged furs and woven grass mats. Storage areas where preserved foods hung from wooden racks. A fire pit with a sophisticated ventilation system that drew smoke up through natural chimneys in the rock. Tools and implements that looked both primitive and ingeniously designed, adapted for hands much larger than human but serving recognizably human purposes. "My God," Livia whispered. "They're people." "People, but not like us," Marcus agreed, moving deeper into the chamber. "Look at this." He held his torch up to illuminate a section of wall covered in what were unmistakably drawings. Not crude cave paintings, but sophisticated artwork that told complex stories. Images of the creatures hunting in coordinated groups, gathering plants, caring for young, and interacting with smaller figures that could only be humans. "They've been watching us for generations," Livia realized, tracing one of the pictographs with her finger. It showed a group of the creatures observing a human settlement from a distance, their postures suggesting curiosity rather than aggression. "Learning about us. And we've been trying to kill them," Marcus said grimly. "Look at this sequence." He pointed to a series of images that clearly depicted conflict. Humans with guns pursuing the creatures, fires burning in the forest, and the tall figures retreating deeper into the mountains. The story was unmistakable. A gradual withdrawal from contact as human expansion made coexistence impossible. But the final images in the sequence were different, more recent judging by the style and condition of the paint. They showed a lone human figure, clearly masculine, carrying what looked like a rifle, not pursuing or attacking, but sitting peacefully near a fire while one of the creatures approached cautiously. "That's you," Livia breathed. "They've been watching you specifically." Marcus nodded slowly. "For how long, I wonder? And why?" As if in answer to his question, sounds echoed from deeper within the cave system, not threatening, but unmistakably indicating the presence of multiple large beings moving through passages they couldn't see. The sounds grew closer, accompanied by what might have been voices speaking in tones too low for human ears to fully process. "We should go," Livia whispered, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they were in this confined space. But Marcus shook his head. "No. Running now would undo everything we've learned. If they wanted to hurt us, they've had plenty of opportunities." He set his rifle against the cave wall, deliberately disarming himself. "We stay. We wait. We see what they want to tell us." The first creature to emerge from the deeper passages was the one they'd encountered the night before. Livia was sure of it, recognizing something in its posture and the way it moved with deliberate care to avoid appearing threatening. But it wasn't alone. 2 others followed, and then more, until 7 of the massive beings stood in the chamber with them. They were all different, some larger, some smaller, their fur ranging from deep brown to silver gray to reddish copper. But all shared the same unmistakable intelligence, the same careful, almost ceremonial approach to this unprecedented meeting between species. The first creature, their original contact, stepped forward and did something that made Livia's heart skip. It knelt, bringing its great head down to human eye level, and spoke. Not in English, not in any human language, but in a series of low, musical tones that somehow conveyed meaning directly to the mind. Livia found herself understanding, not the words but the intent, greeting, welcome, and something that felt like gratitude. Marcus responded instinctively, bowing his head in return and speaking in the same careful, respectful tone he might use with a tribal elder. "We thank you for your gifts. We thank you for your trust." What followed was unlike any conversation Livia had ever witnessed. Through gestures, drawings in the cave's sandy floor, and those strange musical vocalizations, the creatures began to tell their story. They were older than human settlement in these mountains. They had watched the first explorers pass through, had hidden from the waves of settlers and miners and loggers that followed. They had seen the forest diminish and the game scatter and their own numbers slowly decline as safe territory grew scarce. But they had also watched Marcus during his years of solitary hunting, had seen him grow from a young man driven by grief and anger to someone who sought understanding rather than violence. They had tested him, leaving signs and traces to see how he would respond, gradually revealing more of themselves as he proved himself worthy of trust. And now they had brought them both here, because they had reached a decision point. The human world was closing in, their hiding places growing fewer and less secure. Soon they would have to choose between extinction and contact. They were choosing contact, but carefully, selectively, with someone who had proven himself capable of seeing them as more than monsters. With someone whose heart had been opened by love to possibilities beyond his previous experience. The largest of the creatures, one whose silver-streaked fur and dignified bearing marked it as clearly the elder of the group, approached Livia directly. It studied her with ancient, knowing eyes, then reached out with one massive hand and gently touched her face. In that moment of contact, images flooded her mind, not her own memories, but the creature's. She saw herself through its eyes, not the fat, unwanted daughter of a cruel rancher, but a bridge between worlds. A human whose capacity for love had softened the hardened heart of a hunter, whose gentleness had opened doors that violence had kept locked for generations. When the creature withdrew its hand, tears were streaming down Livia's face. Not tears of fear or sadness, but of recognition. These beings saw her as she had never seen herself, as valuable, as necessary, as exactly what she was meant to be. "They want us to be ambassadors," she whispered to Marcus. "Bridges between their world and ours." Marcus nodded, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "And they're offering us sanctuary. A place where we can belong, where our differences make us stronger rather than weaker." The elder creature gestured toward one of the passages leading deeper into the cave system, clearly an invitation to see more. Together, Marcus and Livia followed, their torch illuminating wonders they had never imagined. The cave system was vast, a network of natural chambers and carefully excavated passages that housed an entire community. They saw workshops where the creatures crafted tools and weapons with sophisticated techniques, nurseries where young ones played under the watchful eyes of their elders, galleries filled with art that captured the beauty and complexity of their hidden world. It was a civilization, different from human society but no less real, no less meaningful. A culture that had survived in secret for generations, preserving knowledge and wisdom that the outside world had never suspected existed. "How many?" Marcus asked through gestures. The answer came through drawings in the sand, numbers that indicated a population larger than Livia had imagined possible. Not just this community, but others scattered throughout the mountain ranges, connected by ancient paths and maintained communication networks that spanned hundreds of miles. They were not alone, these hidden people. They were part of something larger, older, more resilient than anyone in the human world had ever guessed. As evening approached, their hosts led them to a chamber that had obviously been prepared for human guests. Sleeping furs laid out in human proportions, food that had been adapted to human tastes, even rough furniture sized for smaller beings. The care and forethought that had gone into these preparations spoke of planning, of hope, of a decision made with full awareness of its implications. "They've been waiting for us," Livia realized. "Not just Marcus, but both of us. They've been waiting for the right humans to bridge our worlds." That night, as they lay in furs softer than any bedding she'd known in her father's house, surrounded by the quiet sounds of an alien but peaceful community, Livia felt something she'd never experienced before, the sense of being exactly where she belonged. Marcus held her close, his arms strong and warm around her, his heartbeat steady against her cheek. "Are you frightened?" he asked softly. "No," she said, and meant it completely. "For the first time in my life, I'm not frightened. I'm home." 3 days they spent in the hidden community, learning customs and language, sharing stories and meals, gradually becoming part of something that had existed in secret since before their grandparents were born. Livia discovered that her soft hands were perfect for the delicate work of preparing medicinal herbs, while Marcus found that his knowledge of the outside world was invaluable for understanding the growing human encroachment on their territory. But on the fourth morning, reality intruded in the form of distant gunshots echoing through the mountain valleys. The eldest creature, whose name was something like a deep musical chord that Livia could approximate but never truly reproduce, summoned them with urgent gestures. Through the cave's sophisticated communication system, word had come from the Outer Watchers. A large party of armed humans was moving through the lower forests, following the same trails that had led Marcus and Livia to this sanctuary. "My father," Livia said immediately, her heart sinking with certainty. "He's come looking for me." Marcus was already gathering his gear, his expression grim. "How many?" The answer came through rapidly sketched symbols in the sand. At least a dozen riders, all armed, led by someone the Watchers recognized from previous encounters. Someone who had hunted these mountains before. "He's brought a hunting party," Marcus realized. "Probably told them we're tracking a dangerous animal, promised them sport and a good story to tell back in town." The eldest creature approached them with something that looked almost ceremonial. A staff carved from dark wood and inlaid with the same strange metals they'd seen in the decorative stones. Through gestures and musical tones, it conveyed a meaning that chilled Livia's blood. "It's a war staff," she whispered, understanding somehow flooding her mind. "They're preparing to fight." "No," Marcus said immediately. "If they fight your father's hunting party, it proves everything the outside world believes about them being monsters. It gives humans an excuse to hunt them to extinction." But the creatures were clearly preparing for exactly that. Throughout the cave system, Livia could hear the sounds of preparation, weapons being readied, defensive positions being established, young ones being moved to deeper, more secure chambers. They had tried peace for generations, tried hiding, tried avoiding contact. But if contact was being forced upon them by men with guns and hostile intentions, they would not go quietly into extinction. The eldest creature placed the war staff in Marcus's hands, its meaning clear: join us in battle, or stand aside and let us face destruction alone. Marcus looked at the weapon, then at Livia, then at the beings who had shown them such trust and kindness. "There has to be another way." "What way?" Livia asked, though she was already beginning to form an idea that terrified her. "I go back," Marcus said slowly. "I meet them before they can find this place. I tell them you're safe, that the danger is past, that it's time to go home. They won't believe you. Not without proof." Marcus looked at her, and she saw the same terrible understanding dawning in his eyes. "They'll want to see you. They'll want proof that their mission was successful." "Then I go with you." "Livia, no. If we both go back, if we both return to that world." He gestured toward the hidden community around them. "This becomes just a beautiful dream. Something that happened to us once, but not something we can build a life around." She knew he was right. The moment she returned to her father's world, she would become his property again, subject to his authority and his plans for her future. There would be no more mountain adventures, no more sleeping under stars, no more growing understanding between worlds that needed bridges. But if she didn't return, if she stayed hidden while armed men searched for her, the conflict that followed would destroy everything beautiful they had discovered here. The eldest creature had been listening to their conversation with obvious understanding, even though they spoke in English. Now it approached Livia directly and placed one enormous hand on her shoulder. The contact brought images, emotions, concepts that bypassed language entirely. She saw herself as the creature saw her, not a pawn in someone else's game, but a person with agency, with power, with choices that could shape the future of two worlds. She saw the decision before her not as choosing between safety and sacrifice, but as choosing between fear and courage, between hiding and stepping forward to claim her own destiny. When the vision faded, Livia knew what she had to do. "I go back," she said firmly, "but not as my father's property. I go back as myself, making my own choices, telling my own truth." Marcus started to object. but she silenced him with a gesture she'd learned from watching the creatures communicate. "Listen to me," she said. "All my life, I've let other people make decisions for me. My father decided I was worthless because I didn't fit his idea of what a daughter should be. You tried to decide what was safe for me, what was best for me. Even these kind people," she gestured toward the creatures, "want to decide whether I should be a bridge or a refugee." She stood straighter, feeling strength flow through her that she'd never known she possessed. "But I'm not a thing to be decided about. I'm a person who can make her own choices. And I choose to go back and tell the truth. All of it. Livia, they'll never believe. They'll believe because you'll be with me to verify it. Because we'll bring proof they can't deny." She looked around the cave, at the artwork and tools and evidence of sophisticated culture. "We'll bring them here, but carefully, respectfully. We'll show them that there's another way to think about what lives in these mountains." The eldest creature made a sound that might have been laughter or approval. Through gestures, it indicated understanding and, more surprisingly, agreement with her plan. "It's dangerous," Marcus warned. "Everything worthwhile is dangerous," Livia replied. "But I'd rather try to build something beautiful and fail than spend my life hiding from the possibility of greatness." They left the hidden community with gifts and blessings, carrying proof that would astound the outside world if they could find the right way to present it. Small artifacts, obviously crafted but clearly not of human origin. Sketches Livia had made of the cave paintings, showing artistic sophistication no savage beast could possess. And most importantly, a letter of safe passage written in the creature's own symbolic language, a document that represented trust beyond anything humans had ever been offered by the mountain's hidden inhabitants. The descent toward the human world felt like traveling backward through time, leaving enlightenment for ignorance, wisdom for prejudice, love for fear. With every mile, Livia could feel the weight of her father's world pressing down on her, trying to reshape her back into the uncertain, self-hating girl she'd been just days before. But something had changed, some fundamental shift in how she saw herself that couldn't be undone by distance or proximity to her former life. Marcus noticed it too, commenting on how she sat her horse differently, how she held her head higher, how she seemed to take up more space in the world rather than trying to disappear. "You're not the same person who was thrown out of that ranch house," he said during a rest stop. "No," she agreed. "I'm not. And I won't pretend to be, no matter what my father expects." They found the hunting party camped in a meadow they'd passed through on their way up into the high country, maybe 10 miles from where the hidden community lay. 12 men, as the watchers had reported, armed with rifles and sidearms, their horses picketed near a stream that would provide fresh water and easy escape if they needed it. Her father was there, looking older and more desperate than she remembered. The other men were a mix of ranch hands she recognized and strangers who had the look of professional hunters or men seeking adventure and violence in equal measure. Marcus rode in first, his hands visible and away from his weapons, calling out a greeting when he was still far enough away to avoid startling anyone into shooting. "Rancher Clayton," he said formally. "I've brought your daughter back safe and sound as agreed." Her father stood from beside the fire where he'd been drinking coffee and planning the next day's search. His eyes went immediately to Livia, scanning her for signs of harm or abuse, his expression complex with relief and anger and something that might have been shame. "Livia," he said, "are you all right? Did he hurt you?" The question was loaded with implications that made her stomach turn. In her father's world, a woman alone with a man for days could mean only one thing, and the assumption that she would be damaged goods afterwards spoke volumes about how he viewed both her value and her agency. "I'm better than I've ever been," she said clearly, loud enough for all the men to hear. "Marcus has been a perfect gentleman and an excellent teacher." "Teacher?" One of the professional hunters stepped forward, his tone skeptical. "What kind of teaching happens up in those mountains?" Livia dismounted and walked toward the fire with confidence she'd never possessed before, aware that every eye was on her but unintimidated by their attention. "The kind of teaching that opens your mind to possibilities you never imagined," she said. "The kind that shows you there's more to this world than what fits inside your comfortable assumptions." Her father's expression hardened. "Enough of this nonsense. You've been gone 4 days," living rough with a man who chases fantasies through the wilderness. It's time to come home and return to reality. This is reality, father. Livia reached into her saddlebags and pulled out one of the artifacts the creatures had given them, a tool unlike anything human hands had ever crafted, beautiful and functional and obviously made by intelligent beings. This is what Marcus was hired to track. Not some mindless beast, but people. A whole civilization living hidden in these mountains. The men around the fire exchanged glances, some skeptical, others intrigued despite themselves. The artifact was clearly genuine, clearly not something that could be easily faked or explained away. "Where did you get that?" the professional hunter demanded. "From the beings who made it," Livia replied. "From the people you came here to hunt." Her father stepped closer, his face flushing with anger. "People? Livia, you're talking nonsense. There are no people living wild in these mountains except renegade Indians, and we would have found sign of them years ago." "Not Indians, father. Something else. Something older." Livia pulled out her sketches, showing them the cave paintings, the sophisticated artwork, the evidence of complex culture. Something that's been watching us, learning about us, trying to decide if we're worth trusting. Marcus stepped up beside her, lending his authority to her claims. "She's telling the truth, Mr. Clayton. I've seen things up there that challenge everything I thought I knew about what lives in wild country." "You expect us to believe in fairy tales?" Another hunter scoffed. "In monsters that paint pictures and build houses? I expect you to believe the evidence of your own eyes," Livia said firmly. "And I expect you to have the courage to admit when your assumptions about the world might be wrong." Her father studied the artifacts, his expressions cycling through disbelief, curiosity, and growing alarm. "Even if this is real, even if there are things living up there, that doesn't change anything. You're still my daughter and you're still coming home." "No, father. I'm not." The words rang out across the meadow like a bell, clear and final and utterly certain. Every man in the camp turned to stare at her, but Livia felt no urge to shrink or apologize or take back her declaration. "I'm not your property," she continued. "I'm not your disappointment or your shame or your burden. I'm a grown woman making her own choices, and I choose to stay here with Marcus and continue the work we've started." "What work?" her father demanded. "Building bridges," Marcus answered. "Learning to coexist with neighbors we never knew we had. Proving that understanding is stronger than fear. And failing that," Livia added quietly, "protecting people who deserve protection from those who would destroy them out of ignorance." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Her father heard it, as did the other men. If they insisted on pressing forward, if they tried to hunt the beings who had shown such trust and kindness, they would find themselves facing opposition not just from hidden creatures but from humans who had chosen to stand with them. "You can't be serious," her father said. "You're talking about throwing away your entire life, your entire future. For what? A handful of stories and some carved sticks." "I'm talking about claiming my life for the first time," Livia replied. "About choosing my own future instead of accepting the one you planned for me." She gestured toward Marcus, who stepped closer and took her hand in a gesture of support and solidarity. "I'm talking about love, father. Real love, based on respect and shared purpose and genuine affection. Not the kind of transaction you've been trying to arrange for me with men who see me as a business merger." Her father stared at their joined hands with an expression of growing horror. "You can't marry him. He's nothing. No property, no prospects, no position in society. He lives like an animal in the wilderness." "He lives free," Livia corrected. "He lives with purpose and dignity and courage. He sees me as I am and loves what he sees, not what he wishes I could become." "And what about children?" her father demanded, playing what he clearly considered his strongest card. "What about the family name, the ranch, the empire I've built for you to inherit?" Livia smiled, and for the first time since she'd known her father, she saw him recognize that she was genuinely happy. "What about them? If I have children, they'll grow up free to be themselves, not constrained by other people's expectations. As for your empire," she gestured toward the vast wilderness surrounding them. "This is empire enough for me." The professional hunters were growing restless, clearly disappointed by the lack of action and hunting opportunities this expedition had provided. One of them stepped forward, rifle held casually but ready. "This is all very touching," he said sarcastically, "but some of us came here to hunt. If there really are large creatures living in these mountains, that's exactly what we're looking for." Marcus shifted slightly, not reaching for his weapon but positioning himself between the hunter and Livia. "Those creatures have done nothing to harm you. They've lived peacefully in this wilderness for generations without bothering anyone." "Peaceful or not, they're still dangerous," the hunter replied. "Things that big, that strong, that close to human settlements? That's a threat that needs to be eliminated." "The only threat here," Livia said clearly, "is the one you're creating with your prejudice and violence." As if summoned by her words, sounds began echoing through the forest around them, not threatening, but definitely indicating the presence of multiple large beings moving through the trees. The horses began to shift nervously, ears flattened against their heads. The hunters raised their rifles, scanning the treeline for targets, but Marcus stepped forward with his hands raised peacefully. "Don't," he said urgently. "They're not attacking. They're just watching. Deciding." "Deciding what?" her father demanded. "Whether humans are worth saving," Livia replied. "Whether we're capable of being better than our worst impulses." The sounds from the forest grew closer, more distinct. Not the random noise of animals moving through underbrush, but coordinated, purposeful movement by beings large enough to make the earth tremble slightly under their feet. The hunters' horses began to whinny and pull at their picket ropes, instinctively recognizing the presence of something far larger and more dangerous than themselves. "Stand down," Marcus called to the armed men. "Lower your weapons and show them you're not a threat." "Like hell," one of the hunters snarled, raising his rifle toward the treeline. Whatever's out there, it picked the wrong group to try and intimidate. But before he could fire, shadows began separating from the forest, not rushing forward in attack, but emerging with deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness. First one, then another, then more, until 7 of the massive beings stood at the edge of the meadow, just within the firelight but far enough away to avoid seeming aggressive. The effect on the hunting party was immediate and devastating. Grown men who had faced down grizzly bears and hostile war parties found themselves confronting something that challenged their fundamental understanding of what was possible in the world. The creatures were obviously real, obviously intelligent, and obviously capable of crushing them all without breaking stride. But they made no aggressive moves. They simply stood there, watching, waiting, letting their presence speak for itself. "Jesus Christ," one of the ranch hands whispered. "What are they?" "They're people," Livia said firmly, stepping forward despite Marcus's protective gesture. "Different from us, but people nonetheless. With families, with culture, with rights to exist in peace." Her father stared at the assembled beings with a mixture of awe and terror. "Livia, get back here. Those things could what, father? Could treat me better than you ever have? Could respect my choices and value my mind? Could see me as more than a disappointing investment." She walked toward the creatures with steady confidence, stopping just beyond arm's reach and offering the same respectful bow Marcus had taught her. The largest of them, the elder she recognized from the cave, returned the gesture with grave dignity. Then it did something that made every human in the meadow gasp. It spoke, not in its own musical language, but in carefully pronounced English words. "Peace," it said slowly, each word clearly an effort but unmistakably understandable. "Harm. Any." The hunters exchanged shocked glances. Animals might be intelligent, might even be dangerous, but they didn't learn human languages. Only people did that. "How long have you been learning our speech?" Marcus asked respectfully. "Many seasons," the elder replied. "When humans pass. I understand." Another of the creatures stepped forward, this one smaller, with reddish fur and what seemed like a more agile command of human language. "We know your ways better than you know ours. We know your names, your purposes, your fears." Her father found his voice at last, though it shook with uncertainty. "What do you want from us?" "What?" The creature tilted its massive head, considering. We want what all people want. To live, to raise our young, to exist without fear of destruction. But you're... One of the hunters started to speak, then stopped, clearly struggling with concepts that didn't fit his worldview. We are what? The creature prompted gently. You're not human. No, the creature agreed. We are not. But we are people. We think, we feel, we love, we grieve. We create beauty and seek meaning. Are these not the things that make a being worthy of life? Livia felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to this patient, dignified response to human prejudice. These beings were risking everything, their safety, their secrecy, their very existence, to try to bridge the gap between worlds. Her father looked around at his hunting party, seeing the same confusion and uncertainty in their faces that he felt. The simple narrative they'd brought with them, track down dangerous beasts, eliminate the threat, return home as heroes, had collapsed in the face of intelligence and dignity they couldn't deny. If you're people, he said slowly, if you have families and civilization, then why hide? Why not make contact, establish formal relations? The elder creature's expression grew sad. Because your people kill what they fear. Because different means dangerous in your world. Because we have watched other tribes that tried to coexist be hunted to extinction. But some of us are different, Livia interjected. Some of us can learn, can grow, can see beyond our prejudices. Yes, the elder agreed, looking directly at her. Some can. That is why we reveal ourselves now. Because we found ones who see with hearts instead of eyes. Who judge by actions instead of appearances. Marcus stepped forward, setting his rifle on the ground as a gesture of peaceful intent. What can we do? How can we help prevent the conflict that's coming? Conflict comes whether we hide or reveal ourselves. Another creature said, its voice deeper, more resonant. Your people expand, take more land, push deeper into our sanctuary. Soon there will be nowhere left to hide. Then we need a different solution, Livia said. We need to create a space where both our peoples can coexist, where understanding can grow instead of fear. Her father looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. You're talking about, what? Some kind of treaty? With creatures that don't even exist according to law and government. I'm talking about doing what's right instead of what's legal, Livia replied. About choosing courage over comfort, growth over stagnation. One of the professional hunters shifted restlessly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. This is all very philosophical, but what about practical concerns? These things are dangerous, even if they are intelligent. What's to stop them from turning on us when it suits them? What stops you from turning on us? The elder creature countered. What stops any people from choosing violence over peace? Civilization, the hunter replied automatically. Laws, government, consequences. And what civilization governs your behavior toward us? The creature asked. What laws protect our rights? What consequences follow from destroying our homes and families? The hunter had no answer for that, and his silence spoke volumes about the hypocrisy of human assumptions about moral authority. We propose something new, the elder creature continued. A covenant between our peoples. Territory set aside where we can exist without fear, where those humans who choose understanding over ignorance can come to learn and share wisdom. You're talking about a reservation, her father said skeptically. We are talking about a sanctuary, Livia corrected. A place where two kinds of people can build something better than either could create alone. The conversation continued deep into the night, with both sides sharing stories, concerns, and hopes for a future that seemed both impossible and necessary. Gradually, even the most skeptical hunters began to see the creatures not as monsters to be eliminated but as neighbors who might be worth knowing. But the most important moment came when her father took Livia aside, walking with her to the edge of the firelight where they could speak privately. I don't understand you anymore, he said quietly. The daughter I raised would never have spoken to strangers the way you spoke to me tonight. Would never have challenged my authority so directly. The daughter you raised was afraid, Livia replied. Afraid of disappointing you, afraid of being alone, afraid of being worthless. I'm not that person anymore. What changed? Livia looked back toward the fire, where Marcus sat in earnest conversation with the creature elder, both of them sketching maps in the dirt and discussing territorial boundaries with the seriousness of diplomats. I learned that I'm not broken, she said simply. I learned that the things you called flaws might actually be strengths. I learned that love doesn't require me to be smaller or quieter or more acceptable. Her father followed her gaze, watching Marcus defend her right to make her own choices to beings who could have crushed him without effort. He really loves you, he said, and for the first time she heard something like respect in his voice when he spoke about Marcus. He sees me, Livia replied. Really sees me, not what he wishes I was or what he thinks I one should become, but who I actually am. And he loves what he sees. Her father was quiet for a long moment. I failed you, he said finally. I was so focused on what I thought you should be that I never saw what you were. You can see now, Livia offered. It's not too late to change. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw him recognize the strength, the confidence, the genuine happiness that had transformed her from the scared girl he'd thrown out of his house. What do you need from me? He asked. I need you to go home and tell people the truth, she said. I need you to help create space for something new to grow. And I need you to trust that I'm exactly where I belong. Her father nodded slowly, and for the first time in her life, Livia felt like his daughter rather than his disappointment. The formal agreement took 3 days to negotiate, with both sides working through translators, maps, and careful discussions of boundaries, rights, and responsibilities. What emerged was unprecedented in the history of human-indigenous relations, a treaty between humans and beings that human law didn't even recognize as existing. The creatures would retain sovereignty over the high mountain territory they'd always inhabited, with clearly marked boundaries that human settlers would respect. In exchange, they would provide knowledge of the wilderness, tracking skills, weather prediction, location of valuable resources, to humans who approached them with respect and peaceful intentions. More importantly, they would establish a formal embassy of sorts, a place where members of both species could come to learn about each other, to trade knowledge and goods, to slowly build the understanding that would prevent future conflicts. Marcus and Livia would serve as the first human ambassadors, living on the boundary between worlds and helping to translate not just languages but entire ways of thinking about what it meant to be intelligent, what it meant to be civilized, what it meant to deserve respect and protection. Her father's hunting party rode back to the ranch with stories that would strain credibility if not for the physical evidence they carried. Tools and artifacts unlike anything human hands had made, sketches of cave paintings that showed artistic sophistication beyond anything savage beasts could achieve, and most importantly, the written agreement itself, signed in both human handwriting and the flowing symbolic script of the mountain people. Within a month, the first curious visitors began arriving at the boundary settlement Marcus and Livia established in a meadow chosen specifically for its accessibility to both communities. Some came seeking scientific knowledge, others hoping for adventure or profit. All left with a changed understanding of what was possible in the world. The creatures proved to be remarkable teachers, sharing botanical knowledge that revolutionized medicine in the territory, astronomical observations that corrected human calendar calculations, and engineering techniques that allowed human settlers to build more efficiently and sustainably in harsh mountain environments. In return, humans provided access to metal tools and weapons that made the creatures' lives easier and safer, written language that allowed them to record their history and wisdom more permanently, and most importantly, political protection as word spread to territorial and federal authorities about the existence of intelligent non-human inhabitants. The relationship wasn't without challenges. There were humans who refused to accept the reality of the creatures' existence, others who saw them only as potential slaves or exhibition pieces to be captured and displayed. There were creatures who remained suspicious of human intentions, who saw the growing contact as a threat to their traditional ways of life. 6 months into their role as ambassadors, Livia stood in the doorway of their cabin watching Marcus teach a group of young men from town how to read the forest signs the creatures had shared with them. The settlement had grown from a single building to a small community of permanent residents and rotating visitors, all drawn by the unprecedented opportunity to learn from beings that challenged everything they thought they knew about intelligence and civilization. Her hand rested unconsciously on the gentle swell of her belly, where new life grew, a child conceived in love and wonder, who would grow up in a world where two species worked together instead of fighting. She hadn't told Marcus yet, wanting to find the perfect moment to share news that would change their lives once again. "The tracks tell a story," Marcus was saying, kneeling beside a clear print in the soft earth near their garden. "Not just what passed this way, but when, why, and where it was going. The depth here suggests the creature was carrying something heavy. The spacing shows it was moving carefully, not in a hurry." One of the students, a young man named Samuel whose father ran the general store in the nearest town, raised his hand. "But how can you tell all that just from marks in the dirt?" Before Marcus could answer, a familiar musical voice spoke from the treeline. "Because the earth remembers everything, if you learn how to listen." Standing at the edge of the clearing was Kala, one of the younger creatures who had become something like Livia's closest friend among the mountain people. Her reddish-brown fur gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and her intelligent eyes sparkled with amusement at the human's amazement. "Kala," Livia called, walking over to greet her friend with the embrace they'd developed, a gentle touching of foreheads that conveyed affection and respect. "I didn't expect to see you today." "The elders sent me with news," Kala replied in her carefully practiced English. "Good news, they believe. There are others." Marcus looked up from his teaching, immediately alert. "Others? Other tribes in mountains far from here. They have heard stories of the peace we have made with your people. Some are curious. Some are frightened. All are watching to see if this harmony can last." The implications hit Livia immediately. If their experiment in coexistence succeeded, it could spread to other regions, other communities of hidden people who had lived in fear and secrecy for generations. If it failed, how many others? Marcus asked, abandoning his lesson to join the conversation. "We do not know all. Our people travel in secret, carry messages through old paths. But the stories speak of tribes in the northern mountains, others in the deep forests of the eastern territories, some who live beneath the Great Lakes." Kala paused, her expression growing serious. "All are watching. All are deciding whether humans can truly be trusted." Samuel and the other students listened with obvious fascination, struggling to absorb the idea that there might be multiple species of intelligent beings sharing the continent with them. "What kind of proof do they need?" Livia asked. "What would convince them that coexistence is possible?" Kala's musical laugh filled the clearing. "Time mostly. Seasons passing without betrayal. Stories of prosperity instead of conflict. And..." She hesitated, glancing between Marcus and Livia with something that might have been mischief in her eyes. "And what?" Marcus prompted. "Children," Kala said simply. "Young ones growing up together, learning from both peoples. Nothing speaks of peace like the safety of children." Livia's hand moved unconsciously to her belly again, and this time Marcus noticed the gesture. Their eyes met across the clearing, and she saw understanding dawn in his expression. "Livia," he said softly. She nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. Marcus crossed the clearing in 3 quick strides and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while the students and Kala watched with delighted laughter. "When?" he asked when he finally set her down. "Spring," she replied. "Early spring, when the mountain flowers are blooming." Kala approached them with that graceful, deliberate walk that was characteristic of her people. "This is great joy," she said, placing one large hand gently on Livia's shoulder. "The first child of 2 worlds. Great responsibility also." "What do you mean?" Livia asked. "This little one will be watched by both peoples. Will be seen as symbol of what is possible between us. Great gift, great burden also." The weight of Kala's words settled over them like a blanket, warm but heavy. Their child would be more than just their child. It would be proof that the barrier between species could be crossed by love and understanding rather than violence. That evening, as they sat by their fire with Kala sharing stories of her people's legends, Marcus took Livia's hand and spoke the words she'd been hoping to hear. "Marry me," he said simply. Not because convention demands it, not because your father would approve or disapprove, but because I want to spend every day of my life loving you and building this impossible, beautiful world we've stumbled into." "Yes," she replied without hesitation, "but I want both our peoples to witness it. I want our marriage to be a bridge, like everything else we've done together." Kala clapped her massive hands together in delight. "A joining ceremony. The elders will be honored to participate. We have rituals for binding hearts, for promising protection to young ones, for celebrating new families. And we'll invite the human community too," Marcus added. "Make it a celebration that brings everyone together." As they planned their unconventional wedding, Livia felt the same sense of rightness that had guided her since that first night under the stars. They were creating something that had never existed before. Not just a marriage between two people, but a union that would bind two worlds together in hope and love. The ceremony took place on the first warm day of spring, in the same meadow where the peace treaty had been negotiated. Livia woke that morning to find the clearing transformed by the efforts of both communities working together through the night. The creatures had woven garlands of mountain flowers and sweet-smelling herbs, creating natural decorations that turned the meadow into a garden. They had also constructed something like an altar from carefully arranged stones, each one selected for its color and spiritual significance according to their traditions. The human guests had contributed their own touches, tables made from split logs and sawhorses, laden with foods from both cultures. Traditional wedding fare sat alongside dishes made from ingredients the creatures had shared, wild greens with flavors like nothing civilized palates had ever experienced, breads made from roots and nuts that grew only in the deepest forest, preserves from berries that ripened in hidden mountain valleys. Livia's wedding dress was unlike anything that had ever been seen at a human ceremony. Made from soft deer hide that had been worked to buttery smoothness, decorated with beadwork that told the story of her journey from her father's ranch to this moment, it was both beautiful and practical, suitable for a woman who had chosen wilderness over drawing rooms. Her father had surprised everyone by arriving 2 days early, bringing with him a gift that moved Livia to tears, her mother's jewelry, which he'd kept locked away since her death, but which he now offered freely as a blessing on his daughter's chosen life. "Your mother would be proud," he said as he helped fasten the delicate necklace around her throat. "She always said you had too much spirit for a conventional life." "Do you really mean that?" Livia asked, studying her father's face for signs of the disapproval she'd grown so accustomed to. "I mean that I was a fool to try to make you into something you weren't," he replied. "You found where you belong, found work that matters, found a man who loves you for exactly who you are. What more could any parent want for their child?" Marcus, meanwhile, was preparing for the ceremony with help from both human and creature friends. Samuel and several other young men from town had appointed themselves his groomsmen, while Kala and 2 of the male creatures served as the equivalent from the mountain community. The elder creature, whose name Livia had finally learned to pronounce as something like Thorn Whisperer, would officiate alongside the human preacher who had ridden up from the territorial capital specifically for this unprecedented ceremony. As the sun reached its zenith, guests began gathering in the meadow. The sight was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Humans in their finest clothes sitting peacefully beside massive, fur-covered beings who represented intelligence older than human civilization. Children from the settlement played together in the grass, their laughter creating a soundtrack of joy that transcended species boundaries. When the ceremony began, it followed traditions from both peoples. The human preacher spoke of love as the force that bounds souls together, while Thorn Whisper sang in the musical language of his people about harmony between different kinds of hearts. Marcus and Livia exchanged vows they had written together, promises that acknowledged both the personal nature of their love and their public role as bridges between worlds. "I promise to love you not just as my wife, but as my partner in building something the world has never seen before," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the meadow. "To stand with you when the path is difficult, to celebrate with you when it's joyful, and to never forget that what we have together is worth any sacrifice." "I promise to be your equal in all things," Livia replied, "never smaller or quieter or more acceptable to make others comfortable. I promise to raise our children to see wonder instead of fear in the world's diversity, and to spend my life proving that love is stronger than prejudice." When they kissed to seal their vows, the cheers and musical calls that arose from their gathered guests could be heard echoing off the mountain peaks for miles around. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with both peoples sharing music, stories, and dances that gradually blended into something entirely new. Human fiddle music found harmony with the deep, resonant singing of the creatures. Traditional folk dances adapted to include partners of vastly different sizes and proportions. But the moment Livia treasured most came near midnight, when she and Marcus slipped away from the festivities to walk alone in the moonlit meadow. "No regrets?" Marcus asked, pulling her close. "Only that it took so long to find you," she replied. "To find this life, this purpose, this feeling of being exactly where I belong." As they stood together under stars that seemed brighter than ever before, a sound drifted across the meadow, not the musical calls of the creatures or the laughter of human guests, but something new. Something that might have been the earth itself celebrating the union of two hearts that had chosen understanding over fear, love over prejudice, hope over despair. 3 months into her pregnancy, Livia stood in the settlement's newly built schoolhouse, watching human and creature children learn together in what was surely the most unusual classroom in the world. The building itself was a marvel of cooperation. Human carpentry techniques combined with creature knowledge of materials had produced a structure that was both beautiful and perfectly adapted to its mountain environment. At one table, a human girl of perhaps 8 worked alongside a young creature barely half her size, both of them carefully drawing maps of the local area under Kala's patient instruction. At another, older students from both species collaborated on a project involving the classification of mountain plants, their different perspectives combining to create understanding neither could have achieved alone. "The herb you call mountain mint has properties your people have never discovered," the young creature was explaining in careful English. "When prepared correctly, it can ease the breathing troubles that come with thin air." "And the bark tea our grandmother makes for fever," the human girl replied. "Your people might find it useful for the joint pains that come with age." Watching this exchange, Livia felt a surge of hope for the future her unborn child would inherit. These young ones were growing up with an understanding of cooperation that would have seemed impossible to the previous generation. But not everyone was pleased with the changes the settlement had brought to the territory. "Mrs. Washington," a stern voice called from the schoolhouse doorway. Livia turned to see Territory Administrator Harrison, flanked by 2 territorial marshals and looking decidedly unhappy about something. "Administrator Harrison," she replied politely. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." Harrison's last visit had been 3 months ago, an official inspection to determine whether the settlement posed any threat to territorial security. He'd left apparently satisfied that the arrangement was beneficial to all parties involved. "I'm afraid circumstances have changed," Harrison said, his tone formal and cold. "I'm here on orders from the territorial governor to investigate reports of irregularities in the administration of this settlement." The schoolroom fell silent as both human and creature students sensed the tension in the adults' voices. Kala moved protectively closer to the young creatures, while the human children instinctively gathered near Livia. "What kind of irregularities?" Livia asked, keeping her voice calm despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. "Reports that you and your husband are exceeding your authority as designated ambassadors," Harrison replied. "That you're making agreements and commitments that only the territorial government has the authority to make." One of the marshals stepped forward, his hand resting conspicuously on his sidearm. "We've also received complaints that these creatures are being allowed to move freely through areas designated for human settlement only." Livia felt anger rising in her chest, hot and protective. "Those creatures have names and families and rights that were formally recognized in the treaty your own government signed." "A treaty that's under review," Harrison said sharply. Questions have been raised about whether the territory has the authority to negotiate with entities that aren't recognized by federal law. "What does that mean?" Kala asked, her musical voice carrying undertones of worry. Harrison looked at the massive being with obvious discomfort, clearly unused to being addressed directly by something he'd been trained to think of as an animal. "It means that this entire arrangement may be declared invalid. Null and void." The implications hit Livia like a physical blow. If the treaty was invalidated, the creatures would lose all legal protection. They would become, once again, nothing more than dangerous animals in the eyes of the law, animals that could be hunted, captured, or eliminated without consequence. On what grounds? She demanded. On the grounds that the territorial government lacked authority to negotiate with non-human entities, Harrison replied. And on the grounds that federal Indian policy requires all such arrangements to be made at the federal level, not by local authorities. But they're not Indians, Livia protested. They're a completely different people with their own sovereignty, their own right to exist. According to federal law, there are only 3 categories of inhabitants in this territory: United States citizens, foreign nationals under treaty protection, and Indian tribes under federal supervision. Harrison's voice was bureaucratically precise. Your friends don't fit into any of those categories. Kala had been listening with growing alarm, her normally calm expression showing distress at the implications of Harrison's words. Now she spoke directly to the administrator, her careful English carrying the weight of desperation. You are saying we have no rights? That the peace we have built means nothing? Harrison looked away, unable to meet her intelligent eyes. I'm saying that I have orders to suspend all formal recognition of the treaty pending a federal review, and to restrict movement of non-human entities to designated areas only. What designated areas? Livia asked, though she was beginning to suspect she knew the answer. A reservation. Boundaries to be determined by federal survey, but significantly smaller than the current treaty territory. The word hit the schoolroom like a thunderclap. Reservation. The same system that had been used to confine and control Native American tribes, now being proposed for the mountain people who had lived free in these lands for centuries before human settlers arrived. And if we refuse? Kala asked quietly. Harrison's expression hardened. Then you'll be classified as dangerous wildlife and dealt with accordingly. The threat was clear: accept confinement or face extermination. The same ultimatum that had been given to countless indigenous peoples across the continent. Livia felt her unborn child stir in her womb, as if responding to her surge of protective anger. This was the world she was bringing a baby into? A world where bureaucratic cowardice and federal overreach could destroy everything they'd built? How long do we have? She asked. Federal investigators will arrive within the month, Harrison replied. Until then, all formal diplomatic activities are suspended. No more joint projects, no more shared resources, no more. He gestured around the integrated classroom. No more of this. As the territorial officials left, taking their threats and ultimatums with them, Livia sank into one of the school chairs and tried to process what had just happened. In the space of a single conversation, 6 months of careful bridge building had been reduced to rubble. Kala approached her carefully, her massive form somehow conveying gentle comfort. What will you do? Livia looked around the classroom at the mixed group of students who represented everything she and Marcus had worked to create. Human and creature children who had learned to see each other as friends and classmates rather than alien threats. I don't know, she admitted, but I know we can't let them destroy what we've built. Too many people, both kinds of people, are depending on us to find a way forward. As if summoned by her determination, Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. He'd obviously encountered the territorial officials on their way out. We need to talk, he said. All of us. It's time to decide what we're really fighting for. That evening, the settlement's main hall was packed with representatives from both communities. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the kind of energy that preceded either great victories or great disasters. Livia sat beside Marcus at the front of the room, her pregnancy now showing clearly, a visible reminder of what was at stake in the decisions they were about to make. Thornwhisper spoke first, his deep voice carrying the weight of generations. My people have faced this choice before. We have seen other tribes make treaties with humans, only to watch those treaties be broken when they became inconvenient. We have seen reservations become prisons, and promises become lies. A murmur ran through the assembled creatures, their musical voices creating harmonies of concern and sorrow. "So what are you saying?" asked Samuel, now one of the settlement's permanent residents. "That we should give up? Let them destroy everything we've built." "I am saying," Thornwhisper replied patiently, "that we must be clear about what we are choosing. If we resist, if we refuse their ultimatum, we will be declaring war on the United States government. That is not a war my people can win through strength of arms. But maybe it's a war we can win through strength of truth," Marcus said, standing to address the assembly. "The federal government's position is based on the assumption that only humans have rights, that only human societies deserve recognition. But we have proof that assumption is wrong." He gestured toward the mixed group of humans and creatures filling the hall. "We have proof that intelligence takes many forms, that civilization can exist without cities, that people can be different from us and still be people." "Pretty words," said one of the newer human settlers, a man named Crawford who had arrived just weeks earlier. "But words won't stop federal marshals with guns and arrest warrants." "No," agreed Livia, rising to stand beside her husband. "But words can change minds. And changed minds can change laws." She looked around the room, making eye contact with humans and creatures alike. Administrator Harrison said there are only 3 categories of inhabitants recognized by federal law: citizens, foreign nationals, and tribal Indians. "But what if we created a 4th category?" The room fell silent, everyone straining to understand her meaning. "What if we declared independence?" Livia continued. "Not as individuals running away from responsibility, but as a new kind of political entity. A nation founded on the principle that intelligence and dignity, not species, determine citizenship rights." The idea hung in the air like a struck bell, resonating with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. Kala was the first to respond. "You speak of creating a new tribe? A people made of 2 peoples?" "I speak of creating something that's never existed before," Livia replied. "A nation where membership is based on choice and mutual respect rather than blood or birthplace. Where the law protects all intelligent beings, regardless of what form their intelligence takes." Crawford laughed harshly. "That's not independence, that's sedition. The federal government doesn't recognize the right of territories to secede, especially not territories populated by." He gestured dismissively toward the creatures. "By whatever these things are." "These things," said Thornwhisper with quiet dignity, "have names and families and traditions older than your nation. These things have lived in peace while your people fought wars that killed hundreds of thousands. Perhaps the question is not what right we have to exist, but what right you have to deny our existence." The rebuke was gentle but devastating. Crawford fell silent, unable to meet the creature's intelligent gaze. "The risks are real," Marcus acknowledged. "If we declare independence, the federal government will respond with force. They'll send troops, not just marshals. People will die." "People will die anyway," said another creature, this one younger than Thornwhisper but carrying similar authority. "If we accept their reservation, we die slowly. Our culture, our freedom, our connection to the land that gives us life, all of it dies piece by piece until only the shells of our bodies remain." Samuel raised his hand. "What about the children? The students in our school? If we're talking about war, what happens to them?" The question struck at the heart of everyone's fears. The integrated classroom had become a symbol of what was possible when different peoples worked together. But it was also full of young ones who would bear the cost of any violence that followed. "That's exactly why we have to fight," Livia said passionately. "Not fight with guns and violence, but fight with truth and law and the kind of courage that creates new possibilities instead of destroying old ones." She moved to the center of the room, her pregnancy making her movements careful but her voice strong and clear. "My child will be born in 3 months," she said. "I want them to grow up in a world where they don't have to choose between their human heritage and their creature friends. Where they don't have to hide parts of themselves to be acceptable to either community." She looked directly at Crawford. "You're right that the federal government doesn't recognize the right of territories to secede. But they do recognize the right of peoples to petition for statehood. And they do recognize the authority of states to define their own citizenship requirements." The implications of her words began to dawn on the assembly. Not secession, but statehood. Not rebellion, but legal transformation within the existing system. You're talking about applying for statehood with a constitution that recognizes creature rights? Marcus asked, following her logic. I'm talking about writing a constitution that defines citizenship based on intelligence and moral capacity rather than species, Livia replied. A constitution that would be submitted to Congress along with a petition for statehood, forcing them to confront the question of what it really means to be a person under law. Thornwhisper leaned forward, his ancient eyes bright with something that might have been hope. And if they refuse? If they say that only humans can be citizens? Then they have to explain why, Livia said. They have to stand before the world and argue that intelligence doesn't matter, that dignity doesn't matter, that the capacity for love and art and moral reasoning doesn't matter. They have to defend the proposition that might makes right and that being different justifies being destroyed. The room erupted in discussion as the implications of the proposal were debated. It was audacious, unprecedented, and fraught with risks. But it was also the kind of bold stroke that could change history if it succeeded. As the debate continued, Livia felt her child move in her womb, a gentle reminder of the future they were all fighting to create. Whatever they decided in this room would shape the world that child would inherit. Looking around at the faces of humans and creatures united in common cause, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And sometimes, she thought, that was enough to change the world.